Okay, we'll let the folks join us here. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Megan Hayes. I work at Shaker Library, and we are very pleased to have with us this evening John Barber, who will be speaking about creating bird-friendly habitats with native and non-invasive plants. We are a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. We have a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to ask your questions. We'll hold the questions till the end of the presentation, and then I'll be sending those on to John. He'll be able to answer those questions at the end. But please do put anything you are thinking about in the Q&A. And I'm going to introduce John, and then I'll let him take it away. So John Barber has been a citizen scientist for over 50 years, active in green space preservation, the recovery of peregrine falcon populations, and the continuing recovery of eastern bluebirds. Now retired after 35 years in the business world, he is focused on restoring and maintaining biodiversity. He continues studies on bluebirds and passionately performs habitat restoration and ecological gardening with native plants. A native of Shaker Heights, he served on the board of the Nature Center for 10 years, including 2 terms as board president. He now serves on the board of the Native Plant Trust. He is co-leading the Friends of Lower Lake, a program of the Doan Brook Watershed Partnership, working to restore habitat around Lower Lake Park in the Shaker Parklands. And without further ado, John, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Megan. And thank you all for being here tonight. I'm delighted to be here. I am issuing a call to action for each of us and providing some steps that I think can be used to go out in your yard, in your local parklands, and restore habitat. The birds will benefit. I'd like to thank Megan Hayes and the Shaker Heights Public Library for hosting tonight's talk. I'm very grateful for that. As part of this presentation, there's a 2-page handout that I've put together that has references, sources of plants, repeats some of the most important ideas that I'm going to talk about tonight. And that handout is going to be sent to you after this talk by Megan, just as a follow-up, along with a link to a recording of this talk. I will refer to the handout from time to time, but please rest assured it's going to be on a website that I'll give you a link to at the end of the presentation. And it will also be sent directly to you after the presentation by Megan. So why are we here tonight? Our native bird populations in North America, throughout North America now, are in trouble. And populations of so many of these species of birds, both resident birds and migratory birds, are declining, and some of them are declining very precipitously. What can we do about this? What can we as individuals do about this in our own backyards and in our local parks, in our city-owned land, and in our neighborhoods? Well, my point tonight, the point of this entire talk is there is much we can do, and there's much we should do, and we need to do that now. So please walk with me through that. Looking outside, most of our seed-eating birds, commonly seen at feeders, have fairly stable populations: goldfinches, nuthatches, cardinals, house finches, species like that. Most of the seed-eating birds have relatively stable populations. The biggest decline is seen in the seed-eating birds, the seed-eating species of birds, as well as some birds that do use feeders. But if you think in terms of which birds are becoming rarer and rarer, most of them are insect-eating birds. And that should be of concern to us. They're simple actions that you and I can take individually in our own backyards and do this. Help the birds. We provide clean and safe sources of water. And that's water that's thawed all year round. It's not frozen as winter approaches. You can use a little bird bath heater, a solar bird bath heater, electric bird bath heater. So provide clean and safe water. provide a variety of trees and shrubs and grasses and sedges native to Northeast Ohio. And I'm going to spend the bulk of the talk talking about how critical these plants are. Step number 3 is never use insecticides or rodenticides. Very, very important. Don't use lawn sprays that include insecticides. That's usually in the program that most lawn services have. That's the June spray. That June spray is just when baby birds are fledging. It's the worst time to be killing insects. And don't use rodenticides. So in some urban and suburban areas, it's very easy to say, I'm just going to put some rat poison out behind my garage because I think I might have seen a rat. But if an owl or a hawk picks up a small mammal that's fed on rat poison, then the hawk or the owl can be poisoned. So don't use insecticides or rodenticides. And finally, never permit cats outside for any reason. Cats are enormous bird and small mammal killers, billions every year. Don't let them outside. So what's missing from these 4 steps? Well, what's missing from these 4 steps is bird feeders. So I didn't say, be sure you always have a full bird feeder with lots of seed in it. I'm not arguing that. Well, why is this? Well, there's nothing really wrong with bird feeders, except that they do very little to help bird populations. Bird feeders are primarily for our benefit and our learning and our enjoyment. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not something where we want to say, I can have a lawn and use lawn sprays and let my cat outside just as long as I have a bird feeder. No, not right. Why is that? Bird feeding is fed primarily by economics, not by ecology. In other words, the species that least need our help are the ones that we're most able to buy food for. Why is that? Seeds feed only a small subset of the birds that are either resident in our yard or migrate through our yard. When it comes time to nest, nesting birds are fed primarily insects. 95% of species that nest in Northeast Ohio are fed insects, not seeds. So bird feeders don't really help nesting birds that much. Nesting success, as studies in England have shown, is relatively equal when feeding or not feeding with seeds. So we don't help parent birds be more successful if we put out a seed feeder. The one that surprised me, the studies that surprised me said that, by the way, in most cases, winter survival isn't increased by seed feeding. So if we have cold weather, birds can either find their own food or they'll just drift south, just far enough to get away from whatever the bad weather is. I thought that was very interesting because I always thought all these birds that flock to my feeder in the winter are surviving because of me. Well, no. And that was shown by multiple studies over in England. One of the things that feeders do, and you'll probably see this in your own yard, is feeders concentrate birds unnaturally. So you'll have flocks of birds, sometimes at my feeder, 20 cardinals at a time. And this kind of thing can spread diseases. For those of you who might have had feeders up for a long time, in the 80s and 90s, there were very serious eye infections, fungal eye infections in house finch populations that dramatically brought down house finch populations. And a good part of that was found to be because this fungus, this eye infection, lived down in the seed hulls underneath the feeder. And if you didn't clean your feeder often enough, then the feeders became the mechanism to spread. One of the more recent findings that I find very alarming is that if you feed through the winter and you feed birds like crows and jays and cowbirds and grackles, the following year you will have, or you may have, fewer successful nestings from birds that are called open cup nesters. So these are birds that simply have an open cup for a nest, like a robin or a cardinal. And one study rather, showed that in neighborhoods that had high concentrations of bird feeders, the following nesting season, practically no robins or cardinals successfully fledged young, because the jays and the grackles and the red-bellied woodpeckers and the crows were so heavily predating on the open cup nest eggs and young birds. Wow. Finally, birdseed, suet, and mealworms can unintentionally, I guess, to us, have a large carbon footprint. Many of them, like for example, mealworms, are often imported from China. And so you think of the carbon that's generated by taking an 11-pound bag of mealworms, manufacturing it in China, and having it end up on a shelf of a bird feed store in Cleveland, Ohio. The transportation costs of that probably offset the benefit to the bird populations. It's quite a thought, but I've put a couple of examples up here on the screen of mealworms, freeze-dried mealworms that are sold to help birds through the winter. And both bags say very clearly, made in China and imported into us. So there are a lot of reasons that I ask you to remember that bird feeders are primarily meant for our enjoyment, our education, our learning, and not so helpful necessarily for birds. But I have bird feeders. I enjoy bird feeders. So there are some best practices that I ask you to think about doing with your bird feeders if you decide to put bird feeders up. I get a great deal of enjoyment out of bird feeders. So remember that bird feeders are for people, and they should always be supplemental to native habitat. Very, very important. A bird feeder in the middle of a closely mowed, naked grass lawn really is an ecological disaster. It may help birds for a while in the winter, even that's controversial, but it's not a good idea overall for biodiversity. Provide high quality birdseed, fresh birdseed, thistle, black oil, sunflower seed. Don't use millet or cracked corn, which particularly here has a tendency to rot very quickly. So thistle and black oil sunflower seed is what I recommend if you're going to be running feeders. And you always want to monitor, and this should be intuitively obvious, you want to monitor what's feeding on bird feeders and what's feeding under your feeders. I keep a list every day. What do I see on the feeders, under the feeders? And on a weekly basis, I clean under the feeders. I take a garden rake and rake up all the used seed, the seed shells and things like that, and put that into a compost bin with Rust Belt riders. I clean my feeders on a regular basis with a mild bleach solution before I refill them. And these are the kinds of best practices that I ask you to do if you do use bird feeders. Well, what about when we're not using bird feeders? Or why am I so adamant that bird feeders are just really the fifth step in a five-step process? Well, that's because most birds eat primarily insects, fruit, and seeds. So how do we help bird populations overall? We plant native plants. Once again, we plant native plants in our yards, in our local parklands, throughout our watersheds. This is the most important step. Why go native? Well, native plants support insects and provide seeds and fruits that birds eat. And we'll talk about how we know this because study after study has reinforced this. Native birds and our native insects co-evolved with native plants in any given ecoregion. So here in Northeast Ohio, it's a very tight web of life. And that web of life has been evolving for tens of thousands of years. And we want to try to keep that web of life as intact as we can. Most of our migratory birds eat mostly insects. And that's why so many of them disappear in the winter when the insects are hard to find. coming through Ohio, they need to refuel, both going north and south. And when they refuel, after a night's flight of migration, they refuel with insects. And almost all, with some exceptions, some very notable exceptions, are nesting birds. The birds that are here in Northeast Ohio nesting feed their young insects, not seeds. So for all of these points, they reinforce again and again, plant native plants. It gets even more specific than that. Habitats like our backyards that have greater than 70% native plants by biomass have the highest nesting success. Study after study after study. Higher than 70% native plant biomass means success for nesting birds. Native plant fruits are more nutritious for birds than cultivars are. A privet berry is much less nutritious than an elderberry. Native plants, once established, need less maintenance and less water than nursery plants. Very, very important. How can we create something that's low maintenance so that we, the people who can make a difference in this world, can then move on to other areas, and we don't have to just stay in our backyards maintaining. And one of the things that we don't really know yet, but I think is going to become clearer, is as the climate shifts and plants change and birds change and insects change, trying to adjust to differing temperatures and changes in temperature. A lot of people are hypothesizing that native plants are our best bet, that they're the ones that have the best ability to help birds and insects and plants, our entire food web, deal with climate change rather than trying to plug in individual parts, individual pieces into that. So one of the things that brings a smile to my face as a bird bander here in Northeast Ohio is a study of bird poop. Wow, are you really going to go here? Yes, I am. There was a Manomet bird observatory study, Manomet is over in Massachusetts, that asked the question, can invasive species replace native species as a resource for migrating birds? So when migrating birds come north in the spring and south in the fall, will invasive plants like privet and barberry and buckthorn, some of the worst, can they help migrating birds refuel the same way that our native fruits can? And Manomet, this study, sampled, because these are bird banders, and so bird banders will be holding a bird in their hand. One of the defensive mechanisms of the bird is to poop in the hopes that it's so shocking that you'll let go of the bird. And at least I, as a bird bander, will often collect that on the front of my shirt. At the end of the day of bird banding, I'm usually pretty stained with berry juice. And the Manomet study collected 970 samples from individual birds. Wow. And of those 970, about 470 contained seeds. And they analyzed those seeds. They washed and sorted and analyzed those seeds and said, this bird poop sample is sampling what these species, and it was primarily catbirds and thrushes that eat fruit when they migrate. What are they eating when they come south in the fall? And as it turns out, they preferred native fruits, and they sought out native fruits. And some of the results of this study very clearly showed that they had a preference for the native shrubs, even if there were more non-native shrubs available. So this chart over on the right of this slide shows black gum and one of the cherries and blueberries. Barberry is berberis, so that's a non-native, one of the viburnums. And they just found that migrating birds very clearly had a preference for native fruits. So I'm beating up on non-native plants, and I want to continue to do that throughout this talk, and there's a reason. Most of the non-native plants here in Northeast Ohio do not support our native insects. Either non-native plants won't feed those native insects, and they also won't serve as host plants for the native insects to reproduce on. And the example here that I will show you is in the upper right-hand corner, there's English ivy and there's some euonymus vines, both of which are non-native. And those species, as you can see from this picture, at the end of the season, absolutely nothing has eaten them. Nothing whatsoever. The leaves are perfectly intact. And down below is a patch of wild ginger, native wild ginger. And you can see holes in those leaves from the wild ginger, from insects eating that wild ginger. And that's a good thing, because if the insects are eating the plants, then the insects are surviving and the birds have something to eat and the food web is intact. Native insects won't destroy their food source. You can see this with this wild ginger. They'll put some holes in it. And some people have said, I'm very worried about insects eating my oak tree, for example. Well, one of my heroes, Doug Tallamy, has a 10-step process for dealing with concerns over native insects eating native leaves. It's a 10-step process. He says, if you walk up to an oak tree that you've planted and you see that insects have eaten holes in the leaves of your oak tree, take 10 steps backwards, and the holes in the leaves won't bother you so much. But you'll be feeding insects. That's the Tallamy 10-step process for dealing with native insects feeding on native plants. In addition, many of the flowers and fruits of non-native species are virtually useless from a nutritional perspective. The example I'll use is is forsythia. Forsythia produces no nectar, no pollen. It produces no fruit that birds can feed on. No caterpillars nest on it. It might as well be plastic. It blooms for about 2 weeks of the year, and the rest of the year, it could just be plastic. Compare that to elderberry or cranberry or some of the native dogwoods, which are so much more beneficial in terms of providing ecosystem services. Many of the invasive plants, as you know so well, looking probably in your yard or neighbors' yards, are very invasive. They will take over everything. Think of English ivy, think of privet, think of vinca. They create monocultures in our yards and parks, and if unchecked, outcompete native plants. They green out earlier in the spring, they stay greener later in the fall, and so they can photosynthesize longer than our native plants can. They shade the ground early in the spring when our spring ephemerals are trying to bloom. All in all, they're bad news for the ecosystem in Northeast Ohio. So why do nurseries sell them? Nurseries sell them because nurseries act on an economic model. And they have said for many, many years, you should buy things that insects won't touch because that way they'll never be disfigured. The leaves will never be partially eaten. Well, that is such a desperate two-edged sword because that means that you're not feeding any insects. And they, in terms of particularly annuals, it is very clearly an economic model. The very traditional model of buy on Memorial Day, go out and plant your garden, mulch, spray, fertilize all summer, and by the way, we can sell you all of those things. Discard on Labor Day when it's time to go back to school, repeat next year and the year after and the year after. And from an economic model that works because you have constant sales of plants. The problem is that the model is based on the calendar, not on birds' migratory timing. So if you plant on Memorial Day and tear things out or clip things back, cut things back on Labor Day, you've missed spring migration, you're too late, and you've missed fall migration, you're too early. And so this model doesn't work to support the food web overall. So let's talk for a moment about, get back to insects for a moment. This is just to me, a delightful slide. I mentioned on an earlier slide that so many of the species of birds that nest in Northeast Ohio feed their young caterpillars. Now, think about caterpillars. They're soft, they're squishy. It's easy to cram them down the mouth of a gaping baby bird without damaging the mouth or throat of the baby bird. They're packed with protein. They're almost the ideal nestling food. And that's why it's so important for us to provide a place for caterpillars, for insects to produce caterpillars, to reproduce and to produce caterpillars. So let's be a little bit more specific. Doug Tallamy and his graduate students picked 20 families of birds. And most of those birds, all but one or two families, are represented here in Northeast Ohio by quite a few species nesting. We have one hummingbird species that nests here in Ohio, but we have quite a few warblers and sparrows and flycatchers and so on. And this chart says, we looked at what gets fed to the nestlings in each of these families. And we've now quantified that. We've graphed it for you. So if you look across the bottom axis, let's start with vireos. You may not be able to read this on your screen, but 67% of the food brought to nestling vireos was caterpillars. And the rest of it is spread out somewhat uniformly across dragonflies, grasshoppers, mantises, cockroaches, true bugs, beetles, caterpillars at 67%, flies and spiders. So if you want to have successfully nesting vireos, red-eyed vireos, which used to be the most common nesting bird in a lot of suburban neighborhoods, you can see that they need caterpillars. And that just happens over and over again. Wrens, starlings, orioles, cardinals, sparrows, warblers, they all predominantly feed their young caterpillars. So how do we help these birds? We help these birds by providing them caterpillars. Where do we find these caterpillars? A graduate student, I guess now a doctorate, has her doctorate, Desiree Narango, did a study in 2019 that it's just jaw-dropping. Please read this with me. If you want to produce caterpillars, what do you plant? So, goldenrods, clover, asters, native strawberry plants, and sunflowers. That's the number of different caterpillar species that have been found on those plants. And then compare that to the list at the bottom. One species of caterpillar has been found on a daffodil, 5 on marigolds, 9 species of caterpillars on zinnias. So every time we plant our yards that are dominated by daffodils and hyacinths and marigolds and cosmos, there's no food for nesting birds. And it is so easy for us to say, you know, this year I'm going to put in 2 different kinds of asters and a sunflower and 1 species, woodland species of goldenrod. Look at the dramatic jump in the species of caterpillars that you're producing for native birds. It's amazing. So much of the work that my co-chair, Friends of Lower Lake, Peggy Spaeth and I do with a very large and enthusiastic crew of volunteers over in the Shaker Parklands on Sunday mornings, is we take out invasive plants and we put in native shrubs, native shrubs, native shrubs, over and over and over again. And right now we're working around Lower Lake and we are taking out all of the species that you see at the bottom of this slide. Privet, porcelainberry, barberry, both species of buckthorns, trees of heaven, buddleia, and we take out forsythia. Look at the number of species of caterpillars that might be found on those non-native shrubs that, in addition to being poor hosts for caterpillars, they're also hideously invasive. They take over every landscape they can. In their place, we are planting dogwoods, 4 to 5 different species of dogwoods: viburnums, witch hazels, 9-barks, oaks, sycamores, birches. And so you can see the foundation of the work that we're doing is to say, if we want to help birds, we want to provide bird food, insects. And how do we do that? This is how we do that. And the last slide and this slide are slides that you can do right now in your yards and in your local parks. This is within your control. So birds are an indicator. What are you seeing in your yard? If you're not seeing a lot of insect-eating birds in the summer in your yard, there's probably a reason why, because they can't find food. So what we're doing is, on the left-hand side of this slide is an enormous pile of non-native buckthorn, both species of buckthorn, Japanese honeysuckle, privet, Norway maple is in front, that came out. And on the right hand, 2 of our volunteers are planting a native shrub with native shrubs all around them. We're working around Lower Lake, which is in the Doan Brook Watershed Partnership, flowing through Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, in the city of Cleveland. The watershed starts in our yards. Everything that we plant in our yards eventually makes its way into the watershed, either by birds or by water flooding, or by wind, or whatever spread mechanism, the soles of our shoes, dirty shovels, they make their way into the watershed. And this is why it's so important for us to stop thinking of our yards as discrete places that we own and we manage, because that's not the case. Our yards are really where the watersheds start, and they are an integral part of the watershed. And we need to plant that way so that we start feeding the watershed with the berries and the seeds of native plants and native shrubs and native trees. To hammer this home a little bit more, when yards, suburban yards and urban yards, are dominated by non-native plants, which is probably the highest percentage of the cities that we live in. If they're dominated by non-native plants, by biomass, those yards produced 75% fewer caterpillars, 60% less likely to have nesting chickadees, one of the easiest species to attract as a nesting species in your yard. If they did try to nest, they contained one and a half fewer eggs on average. The clutches were almost 30% less likely to survive. There's not enough food. The nests produced 1.2 fewer fledglings on average, and maturation was delayed by a day and a half. So it's just a huge penalty to nesting birds to have a yard that's dominated by non-native plants. So let's act, and let's act now. What do? We construct a 5-layer native habitat. That's just one way of describing it. The author, and this reference is on the handout that you'll be getting after the talk, is Sorensen, a woman who wrote a great book, Planting Native to Attract Birds to Your Yard. Our local libraries have it, so you can take it out of the library. You may want to purchase a copy for yourself so that you can mark it up. But the 5-layer native habitat is trees for canopy. Start by planting your trees, and plant now. Fall is a wonderful time to be planting trees and shrubs. Then plant understory trees, dogwoods, pawpaw, sassafras, hawthorn. There's so many, and I list quite a few on the handout. Plant shrubs. And remember, particularly for some of the holly, the native holly species, you're going to need a male plant and a couple of female plants, because they're male and female plants. Plant perennials, and don't plant just one, plant a mass of them. And then finally, leave leaf litter and logs and patches of bare earth here and there in your garden beds. Because as insects try to overwinter, they need leaf litter. They need logs to burrow into. They need to burrow into the ground. So leave some bare patches. You don't and shouldn't cover everything in 4 inches of imported bark mulch. Don't need to. And then finally, one of the things that I add to Sorensen's recommendations is it's also good to grow thickets. And things like dogwoods and elderberries grow very nicely into dense thickets in a corner of your property, on the edge of your property. And that provides hiding places for open cup nesters so that they can get away from the jays and the grackles and the crows and the red-bellied woodpeckers that might predate on the open cup nests. What are we trying to do when we say this? What I'm saying is providing bird seed in the winter should be your last step. Please think through the year, all 4 seasons. In the spring, provide bugs, buds, and shelter. In the summer, bugs, nest sites, nest materials. In the autumn, bugs, fruit, nutritious berries, and shelter. And then finally, in the winter, provide shelter and berries and seeds. So when you look at your yard and what can I do to help birds, take a 4-season approach, not a winter bird feeder approach. One of the things that Talamy and his team have found is that there are certain keystone species that caterpillars like and will nest on, insects will nest on more than any other species, and they're called keystone species. And that is where you want to start. Oaks, cherries and plums, willows, birches, and poplars, for example, on the trees. 75% of caterpillars are found on just 5% of the native genera. Goldenrods, asters, sunflowers, things like this. These are the perennials that you want to start with because they're called keystone species. And more of these are listed on the handout. So it's different. Yes, this is different. It's okay to have a bird feeder for your own pleasure. Please do. There's so much to learn from watching a bird feeder. But please remember that planting native species is for the birds. Use habitat as your first bird feeder by planting a wide variety of plants that are native to Northeast Ohio, and do it now. We need more native habitat now. Please do that now. Oftentimes, particularly when you take older books, when you find older books, you'll find what to plant in these older books. And it's a list of species that primarily produce berries. And the danger is that some of these plants got put on these book lists a long time ago before we realized how invasive they could be. The example I'll use is pyracantha or firethorn, which is almost guaranteed to bring in cedar waxwings in the late winter. And the problem is that those cedar waxwings spread the seed and areas get taken over by pyracantha. It is a highly invasive plant. It's beautiful, but it's highly invasive. You can get the same effect by planting the native winterberry shrubs, which is not invasive. And at the same time, will attract cedar waxwings. Some people have asked me over the years, I would like to plant something that I know will draw one particular species. And I try to discourage that, at least at the start, because that's a very, very, at least to me anyway, it's a very slippery slope. And I'll use a couple examples. Yes, if you want goldfinches, plant sunflowers. And if you want catbirds, plant elderberries. You'll get catbirds. If you want Cape May warblers, plant currants in the genus Ribes, R-I-B-E-S. If you want winter redpolls, plant birches, and you may get winter redpolls, particularly this winter when their northern finches are invading. If you want cedar waxwings, as I mentioned, plant winterberries. If you want starlings, put out mealworms, you'll get them. If you want Cooper's hawks, put up bird feeders, You'll get Cooper's hawks attracted to your bird feeders. But as I go down this list of things that you can plant to attract particular species, we've missed the flycatchers, and we've missed the vireos, and we've missed most of the warblers. So my recommendation is for you to plant the widest variety of native plants that you can in your yard and see what happens. And then start getting a little bit more specific, perhaps saying, maybe would like to try to attract some Cape May warblers. Leave the leaves, leave the logs, flower stalks and seed heads until the spring. 90% of our caterpillars are insect species that produce caterpillars overwinter in the leaves and the soil. So when we rake up all of our leaves and put them out on the curb for the city to take them away, most of our insect eggs are going out onto the curb. So just leave piles of leaves in appropriate places, because there is a high ecological value to a little bit of messiness. And you can talk to your neighbors and say, this is intentional. It's not because I'm lazy, this is intentional. And here's why. And you become an educator. Maybe you can persuade some of your neighbors to do the same thing. How do we know what's good? One of the things that I think is so very important is that here in Northeast Ohio, we are extraordinarily fortunate to have some very, very beautiful metro parks that still have some very pristine habitat in them. And here on the east side of the inner ring suburbs, we have South Chagrin, we have North Chagrin, we have acacia being restored to native habitat. And I encourage you to go out into those areas and say, this particular woods looks a lot like my backyard. And what do I see here through the seasons? I see ferns, or I see big stacks of leaves, or my yard is very sunny and I'm thinking of planting more of a prairie plant. Go to Jackson Field and look at what is there in all seasons at Jackson Field. So pick some of our pristine habitats, compare them to your yard, and then say, I'd like to build something similar in my yard. So in conclusion, make bird feeders your last action, not your first. Please use no insecticides or rodenticides. Please don't. Keep all your cats indoors. Non-negotiable, keep your cats indoors. Provide clean and safe water. Provide a wide variety of native plants. And ensure that you have a diverse habitat all year long, all through the year. Look carefully and enjoy the birds in your yard. When you put up a bird feeder, enjoy your birds there. And thank you so much for being here. One last thing before I stop. People ask me, how do I start this process? Because this just feels too big. My yard is all grass. Well, start small. Cut out a small area of grass. Start now. That's the important thing. Get started. Plant a keystone tree or two in your yard, oaks, willows, cherries, birches. Remove an invasive shrub. Replace it with a dogwood, an elderberry, a ninebark, a buttonbush. Again, see the handout. And repeat this often. Take out an invasive shrub, replace it with a native shrub. Continually transform your yard to a mostly native plant yard. And if you want to learn more, volunteer with a group doing ecological restoration in the Doan Brook, in Euclid Creek, in the metro parks, down in the national park. All of these places have ecological restoration projects going on that you can learn from. And if you can't volunteer for whatever reason, then donate to restoration efforts in the places where you bird. Peggy Spaeth and I have put a large number of resources on a website called www.ecologicalheights.com. Our handout is there, as well as a lot of resources, a number of links to groups that are doing ecological restoration. So please go to that website, use the resources there. There's a way to provide feedback if you'd like to see other resources. post it out there. This is public. It's something that we all feel very passionate about. So please head to that website. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. That was incredible. I was taking notes through the whole presentation, and I have heard it before. So I have a bunch of questions here, and if you don't mind, we'll see if we can answer some specific questions about plants and other advice. The first question is, any suggestions for native shrub species that make good thickets in part or full shade?
I would certainly suggest two things. Let me start by repeating something, which is please go to some of the shady areas at North Chagrin or South Chagrin and look at the shrubs that are growing there. You'll see spice bush, you'll see winterberry. Again, going out into some of these areas that look like the sun condition and soil condition that you have in your yard and see what's there. But I would just right off the top of my head say spice bush and winterberry are two good suggestions to put into a shady area.
Awesome. Okay, let's see. Somebody says they live in Southern Illinois and they want to know what natives apply best for their region, or I suppose more generally, do you have recommendations for how to find local resources for people who are not in Northeast Ohio?
One of the best things to do, again, is to go into an area near you that's in good condition from a habitat perspective and see what's there. You can also go to the National Wildlife Federation website. I believe it's nwf.org. It is on our handout. And there's a place on that website, this is put together by Doug Tallamy and his team, where you can type in your zip code and get a list of native trees and shrubs and perennials that are best for that zip code. Now, it's probably more general than it is absolutely best just for your zip code, but that's a great way to start. Again, go to the National Wildlife Federation website. There's a place where you can put in your zip code. I think that keystone species are even called out on that website.
That's great. Okay, let's see. One of our audience members asks, they are already adding native plants with enthusiasm. Awesome. And now they're thinking about adding a bird bath. So do you have best tips for bird baths and providing clean water, sun or shade on the ground versus on a pedestal? What size, how often to clean?
It's November. And so thoughts turn in November to how do I keep my bird bath thawed in freezing weather in the event that we have freezing weather this winter. If you look at bird feeding stores, and I think even some of the big box stores, and certainly online, there are a number of bird baths that have built-in feeders or places where you can have a plug-in bird feeder that rests in the water itself, thermostatically controlled, so it's somewhat energy efficient. And that's what I recommend for the winter.
Wait, John, did you mean bird heater? Or you said bird feeder attached?
Megan, thank you. There are some bird baths that have heaters built into them.
That's what I thought you meant.
Or heaters that you can plug in and insert into the bird bath. And they are thermostatically controlled. They'll keep the water thawed. They won't boil the water away, and they won't waste a lot of energy. I recommend those. In the summer, there are just about any dish. I prefer them up off the ground, particularly if you live in an area that has, unfortunately, too many stray cats in it. Get it up off the ground. But bird baths of just about any sort, you clean it out when it looks dirty. You're the best judge. I clean ours out probably once a month, literally scrub it out with a brush, refill it with fresh water. And then I use clever little solar powered wigglers, for lack of a better term, but they are things that just move the water just a little bit, enough so that insect larvae, mosquito larvae in particular, don't successfully nest there. I'm all for having a very high population of insects in your yard, and I encourage that. I'm also a highly preferred food source for insects, or from mosquitoes. And so I prefer to have a yard that's full of insects, but not necessarily mosquitoes.
Yes, that's great. Have you ever heard of, are there heaters that also do that, add that movement, or are you saying two different devices in the bird bath?
Two different devices. There aren't, you know, at the time of year that you need the heater, you don't need to worry about mosquitoes laying eggs in the bird bath.
Good point. Okay, great. Let's see. Is there a strategy to redirect woodpeckers from feeding on wooden house boards?
I have heard many stories about things that are very successful. I have had success with only one device, and that is a metal pie plate, empty aluminum pie plate with a hole punched through the bottom of it, tied onto a fairly lengthy piece of string that bangs against the house in the wind and makes noise and seems to scare the woodpeckers off. And I was successful with that over in Maryland on a couple of different occasions with both downy and red-bellied woodpeckers. Other people haven't been successful with them. I think that because in most cases, woodpeckers are drumming on your house as territorial drumming. They're drumming because the sound is so good. I would suggest that you also mount vertically pieces of wood on nearby trees to give them alternative sources to drum on, even standing logs up on end, trying to give them alternatives to your house. I have not found any success nor heard of success of people spraying their houses with pepper spray, firing off loud noises, works for a short period of time. I think the best thing to do is to provide alternatives for the woodpeckers.
Wow, that's perhaps an intractable problem, but sounds like some good thoughts. Okay, we have a person who's in the Canton area looking for recommendations for sources for native shrubs and perennials.
This is there are probably 4 or 5 native plant nurseries down from Scioto Gardens in Columbus, Natives in Harmony in Marengo, Ohio. There are probably 4 or 5 around the Cuyahoga County, Geauga County area. And I would, again, on the handout, there's a list of places that provide native plants on a regular basis. Also, seasonally, primarily in the spring, there are a number of groups like the Nature Center at Shaker Lakes and the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District that have plant sales. The Metro Parks has a plant sale at North Chagrin in the spring. And all of this, of course, is going to be dependent on where we are in the pandemic next spring. But there are 1-day or 2-day plant sales that take place. And then finally, there is an ever-growing cabal of native plant gardeners who will have and willingly share seeds and plants for you, help you learn how to take cuttings of shrubs and grow your own shrubs. In a time when it's hard for us to find large volumes of native plants, I want to encourage people to find, come work with ecological restoration groups, but find people who are growing native plants and learn how to do that and become self-sufficient, because they are remarkably easy to grow, most species, and they're fun to grow.
Awesome. Okay, let's see here. Flowers bought in stores are often grown using pesticides and thus may be toxic to insects and perhaps birds. Is this also an issue with shrubs and trees?
Yes, it is. I believe that the person submitting the question is talking about neonicotinoids, which are a commonly used systemic poison that a number of nurseries use to ensure that their plants, when they're ready to sell them, are absolutely perfect. And that there is no sign that anything has eaten them. The leaves are perfect, the plants are brand new, and they have a higher economic value. Neonicotinoids get into the bark, they get into the flowers, they get into the nectar, they poison pollinators, and in many cases, the few tests that have been done show that they can persist up to 18 to 24 months in plants, meaning that if you plant a plant in the spring and it blooms that summer, it can be poisonous to any pollinator, butterfly or insect, bee, native bee, honeybee that comes to that flower. So the solution is that every time you buy a plant from a store, you ask, preferably ask the owner to say to your face, I will certify that I do not use neonicotinoids or any systemic poisons on my plants, in my plants. And there's some that say, I don't think we do, not good enough, because what you'll see are row upon row of perfect plants. Most of our native plant nurseries that are on the handout and that I've talked about before very clearly say, we do not use any neonicotinoids or systemic poisons. But the issue is when you find a purported native plant in a plant nursery that sells mostly annuals or something like that, you have to ask, and you have to be pretty assertive about it to say, this is important to me as a consumer, and if you can't honestly say no, then I'm not going to shop here. We have dollar power in what and where we buy.
Wow. Okay. Another person is asking, my bees have been drowning in my bird bath. How can I prevent this?
That's a fairly common event, particularly if you have beekeepers near your yard. So you have a lot of European honeybees who just seem to have this tendency to drown themselves. A lot of the native bees, I've found most of the native bee species know to avoid that. But probably the best way to solve that is to have in your bird bath a relatively coarse and gently sloped rock, like a sandstone, not hard to do in this part of Ohio, but you have it half in and half out of the water. Because where I see bees get into trouble is when they are on a very smooth ceramic bird bath surface or a plastic bird bath surface that's very smooth, and they are trying to get to the water and they literally just slide. So you can put a couple of small rocks, small flat rocks, partially in and out of the water in your bird bath, and the bees can then move down those rocks into the water without falling in.
Sounds great. One of our audience wants to know, are snowberries good for caterpillars? And they give me the Latin if you don't. Symphora carpos.
I don't remember off the top of my head. Please look at the Ecological Heights website, because there is a list of a number of caterpillar species found by genus, and you'll find that genus on there. You can look up, there's probably 150 genera of plants on that list. I don't remember that one off the top of my head. My guess is if it's a native shrub, it probably does have a pretty high food value for insects forming caterpillars.
Okay, that's great. One of our audience says, I think you mentioned rodenticides being a problem as well as insecticides. Maybe I missed it, but what's the relationship with rodenticides and native birds?
It's fairly straightforward. I mentioned a little bit of it during the talk. If you put rodenticides out, you'll probably put out either a granular food, often brightly dyed with turquoise or something like that, or it will be small blocks. And those blocks are meant for rats in particular to gnaw on them. And those blocks contain warfarin, which is a blood thinner, and it will cause the rats to hemorrhage and die, and you won't have a rat problem. And they are sometimes effective. The problem is, first of all, that you're going to have all your native mammals, your shrews and your voles and your field mice, maybe even squirrels, chewing on those things and getting poisoned, and we don't want that. But also, as anything, rats or native mammals chew on these things, if they get a sublethal dose, so it doesn't quite kill them, but it weakens them, and they are out and about, there will be hawks and or owls that will take the easy prey. There's no taste to this poison. And as the hawks and owls eat these small mammals or even these rats, the hawks and owls start to build up the poisons, the warfarin, and it will kill them. That is something that we very, very much want to avoid, particularly as owls and hawks have become more accustomed to suburban neighborhoods. So we see more hawks and owls. So let the hawks and owls be the rat predators and the small mammal predators. Don't poison them.
Yes. Okay. So now we have a question about cats. This audience member says, I understand the danger cats present to birds, but I just can't bring myself to imprison my cat indoors for all her life. Please, can you speak to the relative efficacy of mitigation measures like collar bells, leash training, or declawing, or other measures?
This is a highly sensitive subject, but to me, it's a very straightforward answer. Short of being on a leash, there is no safe cat outside. Cats learn to hunt even if they're belled, and they can walk quietly so that the bell doesn't ring. If cats are moving around the yard, nesting birds like catbirds and cardinals will flush off their nests when they see the cat to try to lure the cat away from their nest. And that leaves open cup nesters more vulnerable to winged predators like blue jays and grackles and so on. Incubating birds need to stay on their nests. Declawed cats still continue to scare birds off their nests because a nesting bird has no idea how serious a threat a cat is. My recommendation is that you build on the back of your house a catio, which is a screened in place where a cat or cats can sit and watch birds from inside a screened porch or whatever you want to call a catio. They can watch, but they can't stalk and they can't prowl around. The death toll from cats is in the billions of birds and in the billions of small native mammals like voles and shrews and field mice that we want, moles. And so it is unconscionable to me that you would give a cat every opportunity to survive through shots and a dish of food and a warm place to live, and then say to them, go out and try not to kill anything, because it's a cat's instinct to hunt and kill things, and you're making it so easy for them. Please don't build a catio or take your cat out on a leash, and that's the only time cats should be outside.
I actually have a friend whose partner has built catios. They have a pretty elaborate one in the back of their house, and if anybody's interested, they can get in touch with me, because it's amazing and the cats love it. So that's a great idea. Okay, let's see. Okay, this is a question about birdhouses. A newbie bird watcher here, lots of time at home this year, as we all have. We have a birdhouse that had a wren family this year and loved watching them. How many birdhouses can an average backyard have? And also, do you clean out the birdhouses every year?
Megan, depending on what an average backyard is, you're usually going to have one pair of wrens nesting in a backyard. You might be able to have a pair of wrens nesting in your backyard and one in your front yard, and they'll tangle in between territorial-wise. I would not put more than one or two houses up on a pole, up on poles in your backyard, and you want to put them up on poles so that predators can't get into the nest boxes. I would put one or two up in your backyard, and no more than that. Please, in suburban areas or urban areas, please don't think that if you have a somewhat wooded yard that you're going to attract bluebirds. You're probably not. But look for wrens and chickadees and titmice and nuthatches. And I would suggest that you put up a variety of bird houses rather than asking how many of one kind I should put up. And if you look out on the web at nest box plans for titmice and for Carolina wrens that usually go up under your eaves, for shelves that robins will nest on up under your eaves, look for a variety of nest boxes rather than how many kind of standard Home Depot bluebird houses can I fit in my yard. Look for that variety and put up a variety of houses, and then just keep note over the years who nested where and who built where. This is all part of the how do you enjoy birds in your yard? Keep records from year to year and see what works and what didn't work.
And do you have any recommendations for how often to clean them?
I clean the bird houses that we have here in Cleveland Heights out after each nest use. So when a house wren nests, at some point the young fledge, the house goes quiet, it's empty. I will go in and clean it out. If I forget, that's fine. In most cases, nobody's going to nest there again this season anyway. But certainly once a year, I check to see, is there any maintenance that needs to be done? Is the roof still secure and not leaking? I clean it out literally by pulling the nesting material out, and then I use an old paintbrush to clean out the corners of the nest box to get all the dust out, to make sure that no parasites overwinter. I do encourage that if you use, as some people suggest, canned air, pressurized air, that works very, very well, but please make sure that you are upwind when you do that, because the dust that's in the bottom of a nest box is not good for you.
That's very good advice. Okay, well, it looks like that's the end of our questions. There was a request to re-mention the book title you were talking about planting native. I think it was Sorensen, Susan or Sharon Sorensen?
Sharon Sorensen, S-O-R-E-N-S-O-N. The title is Planting Native to Attract Birds to Your Yard.
Okay, great. And that is in the Shaker Heights library and the CleveNet system for people to check out, as is our several books by Ptolemy, who you mentioned, Doug Ptolemy. And all of these books on the list are awesome. There are several people who have said, thank you very much, very informative, great program. That's all of our questions. John, this has been amazing, very informative, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Have a good evening, everybody.